Welcome to the Brookbanks podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wakeling, the head of cost and commercial here at Brookbanks. And today we are delving into the mysterious world of, or for me at least, of utility infrastructure procurement. I'm very pleased to have with me a couple of guests. First of all, Matt Capper, who is Director of Utilities, Brookbanks. And we're very pleased to have Emily Timmins with us, Project Management Director at Made Partnership. So if I could ask you to just give a little brief overview of who you are and your experience and how you've got here. Matt, we'll head over to you first.
Thanks for having me. So I'm Matt Capper, I'm Director of Utilities at Brookbanks. So I joined Brookbanks a couple of years ago. I'm about 15 years or so in the utilities industry, and my background is sort of largely utility consultancy across various different sort of schemes and consultants. So I support clients with the procurement and delivery of utility infrastructure on schemes, whether that be disconnections, diversions, connection strategies, multi-utility procurement, or project management of utility infrastructure.
And Emily, over to you.
Hi all. Emily Timmins. So I'm Project Management Director at Made Partnership. Made was actually set up last year, so it's in September 2024, and it's a JV, massive developer JV between Barratt Redrow, Homes England and Lloyds, with the primary aim of really kind of bringing forward large, complex strategic sites, so over 1,000 units or so, but more kind of up to 10,000. So really the kind of large garden villages, SUEs. And my background, so for my sins, I'm a civil engineer by background, but it's been a long time since I've actually done it properly. So I've been in master development for 12 years. But before that, did a bit of time contracting, consulting. So I've done the rounds a little bit, and I'd very much say I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, get stuck into everything, but kind of technical background really. So utility provision on kind of large sites has been something I've done in all guises over the years. But we'll get back into that in a bit more detail.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's great to have you with us. Thank you, Emily, for your time, and Matt, of course. I don't want you to feel left out. Mm-hmm. I have to confess something. I don't know much about utilities. For me, it's a very murky world full of initialisms and acronyms and so on. So you might have to bear with me, but as we make our way through the podcast, but we will all hopefully learn something, myself especially, by the end of this. But Matt, over to you then. What would you like to run through in our time today?
Yeah, so I think the kind of main theme for the podcast is largely around procurement options for utilities for strategic sites. There's quite a lot in the industry at the moment about capacity scarcity and sort of issues with being able to actually secure capacity for schemes. But I think there's a big gap at the moment about the sort of changing landscape for procurement of utility infrastructure for schemes. Sort of 20 years or so ago, that was quite a linear situation, and you sort of went to the incumbent network operators and you sort of asked them for what you needed, and they would provide a quote, and you would go down that route. And gradually over the last 20 years, deregulation has sort of unlocked the industry, and sort of starting with gas and then electricity and latterly water has become deliverable by independent operators. And so that really now, particularly on very large strategic schemes, is sort of quite mature, and there's a lot of options around how you structure the procurement, and what's sort of important to different clients can become a key part of how you procure that infrastructure. So the roles of distribution network operators, DNOs, independent connection providers, ICPs, and independent network operators, IDNOs, all sort of come together under quite often a sort of multi-utility banner to allow us to procure electricity, gas, water, telecoms, and sort of latterly the adoption of drainage infrastructure as well, to provide sort of more tailored solutions, I suppose, for clients, particularly of the kind of scale of scheme that Emily looks at, sort of large, sort of thousands of unit sites. So the hope is just to go through a couple of those, how that all sort of fits together, and what's on the horizon, I think, as well. Sort of what we're looking at on some of the newer, larger schemes that's really sort of on the edge of what's sort of coming to market, I suppose.
That all makes sense so far. Emily, as a master developer, then what do you look for when you're procuring utility connections and contracts on a large 1,000+ unit site?
It's not a quick one to answer, but and certainly one size doesn't fit all. So as Matt said, there's lots of options now, and some of the larger sites that we are looking at multi-solution options as well. So we are looking at more of a traditional all-electric scheme, with future home standards coming in. Most house builders are aligning themselves to the kind of air source heat pump solution in property, all-electric. That's obviously testing capacities in some areas because, capacity-wise, you need more electric to do that. And also heat networks are becoming a bit more normalised. They should be regulated in the next year or two, which again is kind of, from a master developer point of view, giving us a few more options to look at, which actually have the ability to bring down capacity requirements, because a kind of centralised district heat network can reduce capacity required overall, which has, on some of the sites that had thousands of units, that has could have a massive benefit, millions of pounds savings if you're not having to trigger off-site reinforcements somewhere on the grid. And also things like smart networks. And we'll probably kind of draw on some of these again later with Matt and delving into some of the benefits. But I think from a master developer point of view, obviously there's the end solution, which is a consideration on the kind of broader capacity. But then I suppose for me, it's got to be deliverability and getting a trusted partner to deliver, and that will turn up when they say that these are long-term projects, so they're kind of 15, 20 years in the making. So if we're kind of committing to delivering, infrastructure and strategic infrastructure for the site, then we have to be absolutely sure that, the company we're going for has, good covenant strength, but also, has capacity in the area, and, we'll be at the end of the phone, at the end of the day, if something goes wrong. We are, as a massive developer, we're delivering service parcels of land, and we are promising third parties when we give them a piece of land that they're going to get X, Y, and Z. So having somebody that does that and that we can trust to do that is probably the most important. Obviously, cost and program feature in that debate, but that is really key for us.
Yeah. So it's very interesting talking to people in other disciplines, because they always say at the end, obviously cost is important as well. Obviously cost, for me and my team, the cost is one of the most important things. I'm really intrigued by the capacity point, as you say, Emily, because obviously Future Home Standard has come in, so there's no more gas. As far as I'm aware, data centres are springing up all over the place, which I presume have a huge draw on capacity. Is that a fundamental countrywide issue, the capacity, the availability of electricity, or is it just something that may need a bit more consideration when you're coming to procure and deliver a large scheme?
There's a lot of podcasts, I think, and a lot of conversation about how the kind of countrywide sort of, there's hotspot areas where there's particular issues, but sort of largely, site by site, that's sort of a lot of what we do early doors, is going out and sort of trying to identify where the capacity issue is, procure utility infrastructure easily. I think the interesting part of it, and something that isn't mentioned very often, is what we can now do from an on-site solution, I think, which looks to minimise what we need and really try and drive down the overall demand requirement for a scheme. And I think, looking back a couple of years, EV charging points came in, and sort of everybody kind of panicked and went, oh my God, we need loads of additional capacity for EV charging points on plots. And sort of gradually that kind of petered out. And now we're in a position where sort of standard ADMDs for schemes, that's after diversity maximum demand. So it's the load that's allowed per plot, now caters for the allowance for a sort of fairly standard 7.5 kilowatt EV charger on a plot. And I think we're seeing the same sort of trend with air source heat pumps, where they're sort of quite new to the market. There isn't huge amounts of data around delivery, albeit the Future Homes Hub is doing a lot of work around that. But sort of broadly, the ADMDs that we were seeing required, a year ago, are being driven right down now, and we've got schemes that were at sort of, an average of kind of 4 kVA a plot, down to sort of under 3 in some circumstances, and some of the IDNOs are really taking a view on that. So there's sort of that part of it, and then there's district heating, and sort of how much of a difference the implementation of district heating can make on power requirements. So that doesn't always sort of solve the problem. It doesn't always answer the question around procurement, but there are sort of concrete steps that we can take on site that will help to alleviate those issues. And I think, we are on the larger schemes getting earlier engagement. I think as we have on a couple of schemes with you, Emily, earlier engagement from the DNO, and their sort of main drive and their main request in that engagement is that we consider this sort of newer infrastructure on sites and really try and implement it early doors, so that they don't have to find as much capacity in the network as they would do sort of ordinarily, I think. And that again wraps into the sort of considerations from master developer perspective that Emily will look at. Is it a social responsibility question, and is that traded off against, I suppose, your ability, Emily, to dispose of parcels to potential purchasers, isn't it? It's a fine balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think just on that point, Matt's a really good one. We are sat between what might be regulated either through planning, net zero, requirements through to then actually what's market facing at the end game to third parties, because the two are normally poles apart. So there really is that balance to play. And I think, to go to the point on capacity, it's in it's in the developer's interest as well to try and minimize what we ask for grid, because clearly there's a cost implication for it. So, my gut feel on it is that we'll end up going towards a solution that's kind of multifaceted, really. I don't think we're quite there yet. And I think we've got that the house building industry's got to normalise the non-standard that is classed as it at the moment, because anything that's not within their standard house type that they've planned for becomes difficult and hard work, which then undoubtedly has a cost implication to the developer. If it's not normal, it's there'll be a cost to the land value, so they won't pay as much because it'll be seen as abnormal. So there's a journey I think we've got to go on in development and house building industry to educate the house builders and end users, because actually a lot of something that might seem complicated on the front end because it's an unknown technology actually could have really big benefits for the customer. It could be, a lot of the heat networks are fully maintained up to the point in the house, which the customer's not having to buy a boiler every 5 years or having to do it, or an air source heat pump that's expensive to the customer to replace after 10 years. So, but that, I don't think the education piece is there yet. So you just get a knockback, and what might be at the kind of social value end or sustainability end of of what we want to achieve on these big strategic sites, because ultimately we want them to be market leading, net zero where we can, but then we've still got to actually sell and deliver the houses, which means it's got to be market facing. So it is a difficult balance, and I think it's just the case of doing things like this and trying to get the word out there that actually there's in the industry we are wanting to move along that trajectory of more sustainability, but we've got to move everybody else with us.
Yeah, and I think you don't see the kind of, sorry Ben, the point I really want to make on this, but there isn't the sort of customer drive I think there at the moment, because people aren't experiencing what it's like to own a home with air source heat pumps. They're not sort of on a site, very frequently. I know that sort of, some people are bringing them forward and they're implementing them, but that's sort of, it's become the industry standard without us actually having got there yet almost. And sort of it's the default, but really without a lot of sort of people actually experiencing it. And I do think, there will be a time at which people are sort of actually moving into large scale developments with this in place. And, I don't want to bash air source heat pumps because I think there's enough of that done online, but I think there will become quite a stark comparison between having an air source heat pump sort of edge of plot, within your boundary outside, the cost of running it, the sort of risk of theft, I suppose, at the sort of build stage and that kind of thing. They're quite expensive units sat on pads outside, and that compared to a district heating system or a ground source heat pump system, which is cheaper, as you say, cheaper to maintain, cheaper to run, isn't as visually intrusive on plot. You can sort of see a point where the sale between those two, or certainly the customer preference between those two, will be the district heating solution. So I think we're going to be in a significant period of transition as the Future Home Standard actually gets implemented, whenever that actually starts to bite and we move into that. But I think there will become a driver for the district heating solutions that currently there isn't really this kind of sales push for, I don't think, and that'll be really interesting. I think
I agree. I think in my previous life in PLC house builders, I think there was a lot of attention given to, as you say, Emily, educating or supporting, I should say, the customer on how to use an air source heat pump, how to run it, because, as you say, the average kind of customer on the street, myself included, would see an air source heat pump and be looking around for a thermostat and wondering, how on earth do I heat my house in the winter months. And I think, to Matt's point, there's also an education piece around developers as well. As you say, it's air source heat pumps are going to be installed as part of Future Home Standard because that's kind of seen as the done thing, whereas actually there's other options there. There's district heating, as you say, which isn't very common on a lot of residential schemes, certainly outside of London. And I suppose that there's a question there around, is that because people are discounting it for reasons such as, I don't know, cost or just whatever it might be?
That's it. I think the main reason is because of regulation. So it's they have to have, without regulation, they have to have full commercial kind of legal models that sit behind that to actually make them workable, which is, complicated and has a lot of, you can't just go to USwitch and change your provider easily. However, the market is moving on, which is why I think we're probably talking about it more. And, Matt's looking at a couple of large sites for myself, and it is very much a consideration there, but it's not regulated yet. So we've got a strange kind of limbo situation where we're looking at it, but not all the boxes are ticked. And I think once it is, I think it will become a lot more common, because there will be all of the financials, legal side in place. That Ofgem will cover it. They'll be able to lay utilities in highways the same as any other utility provider. So all of the benefits of becoming a kind of regulated body just makes the kind of end game and process a lot easier.
Yeah, and I think the financial side of that, we're talking enormously more about district heating than we were even 6 months ago. And I think, largely that's a driver, particularly from the sort of part of the world that I work in, utility consultancy. It's a driver that a lot of the sort of asset adopting IDNO and ICP partnerships are starting to bring forward partnered solutions for the delivery of that infrastructure, where that wasn't the case, 6-12 months ago. And so implementing a district heating system on a scheme was expensive. It was capital intensive. It had challenges around the ongoing management of that system. And I don't think, the systems themselves, like the fundamental technology, is not actually that new. The district heating systems have been implemented across the UK for years and years, and abroad, more widely than in the UK. I think the fundamental difference is that the cost model, along with the regulation drives that, because these sort of parties only want to get involved in it because it's now becoming regulated. The fundamental drive behind that is that the costs are coming down. When we're looking at schemes, we're looking at the cost comparison between a multi-utility solution with air source heat pumps on plot against a district heating system, whether that be centralised or it be, a ground source heat pump system on plot. But because the providers often provide the heat interchange unit or the heat pump in that situation, actually from a cost comparison perspective, there's not that much in it really. They're quite cost comparable. So that's a huge change from where it was, even a couple of years ago in terms of sort of viability, I think, for these kind of schemes.
And Matt, what kind of things do you look at then when you're working with Emily on large multi-parcel master developer schemes? What kind of things do you look at to de-risk areas such as cost and time and capacity and that kind of thing?
I think, that you can sort of largely separate it out into sort of the off-site issues, I guess, and the on-site issues, I suppose, on these schemes. So, we've talked about the capacity constraints. Where's your capacity going to come from? How long is it going to take to get there? But I think the sort of change that comes hand in hand with that is that on these larger schemes now, even if we do find capacity for the site, we often have to go back to a primary substation somewhere, and that results in kilometres and kilometres of off-site cable lay or off-site pipe lay. And so then you're looking at the risks around that route. Is there any third-party land issues? Are we crossing bridges? Have we got to directionally drill something like that? And those issues arise more and more frequently now on these schemes, because we've just got to go further to get to somewhere where there's power. And then on-site, it's all the things we've talked about. It's balancing the solution and the cost against the saleability of the scheme or the deliverability of the scheme, and how much do we need to do early in a project to make sure that we've sufficiently minimised the risk that when it comes to move forward, we know it's deliverable. And those are sort of all the kind of balancing factors. But it starts with where's the capacity coming from, but it certainly doesn't end at that point. There's a huge amount of additional work that needs to be done earlier and earlier, I think.
Yeah, and I think from my point of view, I think working with the likes of Matt, so that Matt understands the project objectives as early as possible, because every project's different. So, for example, how it's funded. I mean, if cash is a constraint, we will be certainly looking to try and work with the multi-utility providers to try and offset asset values up front, to try and reduce capital, kind of to do the off-site work to minimise that cost, because that can be, it can be significant about values of money, and which can have an impact on IRR and whatever the metric is. But then on the flip side, you can get sometimes where you've got some funding possibly that you've got to spend, and actually you can get a potential better long-term cost from that by bringing forward some of the spend early, which potentially would drive better asset value. So I think it's just working with the consultant team and the project team to make sure that everybody's clear on what the objectives are for that scheme. And I think and having it clear through the tender process as well, so that you don't get to the end and you're comparing apples to pears because one's not doing what you need it to. So I think, and like I say, every site has its nuances.
And I suppose it's the balance of cost and delivering and timing as well on site, because if you've got a big 1,000, 2,000 plus scheme that's got all these parcels that are being sold at different times, what you don't want to do is pay too much up front. You want to be able to stagger that carefully and think about the phasing and the timing of the delivery of those utilities to make sure that you're managing your cash flow whilst still delivering the parcels that you need to.
Absolutely. And I think one big consideration from myself, and I've been talking to the industry about quite a bit, is just not how do we get to a point where a master developer gets certainty on delivery of key infrastructure, but then potentially giving flexibility to plot purchases of who delivers it for them. And it's not an easy solution to get to. You could potentially tie up the ultimate owner of that system, so the asset owner, with somebody then stepping in at different phases, actually delivering it for it. So that the latter being the ICP, the independent connection provider, but the actual kind of contractual side and then passing over the delivery to the house builders, but keeping hold of the asset is really, really complicated. And I don't think there's not an easy solution. In my dream world as a master developer, we would get some benefit from asset value off the capital cost to start with, and then we would only be putting in the spine mains, and then ring fencing the plots, but knowing broadly what that cost is and the benefit of those cost connections, but then allowing the third party house builders to draw them, call them off and use whoever they want to install it, because every house builder has their own favourites of who they want to deliver it. So really, you don't want to get 10, 15 years down the job having committed to the full site delivery by one individual, one company that then either, is struggling, you end up, in contractual issues down the line. It's a difficult one to commit. On a large site, you're committing potentially a company to be there for 20 years. So you've got to be really sure about, who delivers and will they be around in 20 years' time. And I've had it on a few sites where we've had some multi-utility companies decide they don't want to operate anymore. So you've had novations happen, which just make things really, really painful, which is something you want to avoid.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into the next bit I actually wanted to talk about on this. That's worked out really well. So I think we've talked about sort of solutions that are kind of combined, I suppose, in that they're the kind of multi-utility plus IDNO kind of packaged solutions, the district heating solutions and things like that. But there is a sort of another direction that the industry is going in, which is to sort of split those roles out, I think, and procure them as separate items. So I think what Emily's talking about there is, some of the IDNOs have started to do sort of a director-developer role, where previously they would approach an ICP, a multi-utility company, and they would offer asset value to that company, and that gets packaged up as a kind of multi-utility quote. So you've got the sort of capital cost of delivering the infrastructure, and that's offset by the asset value, which is the money that an adopter gives you to buy the network that you're building off them, basically, and sort of one offsets the other, and in an ideal world, it reduces the cost down as much as possible. Particularly, as Emily says, in these kind of large strategic schemes that are multi-phase, and they've got a master developer element to them, and they've got lots of different sort of residential parcels that might be sold to different developers, or mixed-use parcels that might go to different developers. There is a sort of drive towards procuring them separately, as Emily says. So you can contract with an underlying IDNO, so a company that adopts all of the network, and you can layer on top the contractor that sort of delivers the infrastructure. So you can ask them to purely deliver the spine road in the first parcel, and the procurement of the latter parcels can be left to the parcel purchasers, which retains an element of commerciality, I suppose, for the master developer. They're not committing to one contract that's going to go up over time and be subject to variation, and it means you can sort of tender individual parcels as you come forward, which is sort of more in line with, I suppose, the way that you deliver drainage or other sort of parts of kind of main spine infrastructure. And that's I think the sort of counterpoint to the district heating stuff that's really starting to sort of take off with some clients. They, particularly with the advent of, or the implementation of NAV, people have had massive issues in the past with getting drainage adopted, for example, because incumbents have been quite challenging to deal with. Well, now you can build a relationship with a specific adopter, and you can build network to their specification, and you can take them from site to site to site, regardless of what sort of network region you're in. So I think this is the sort of counterpoint to the district heat conversation, I think. And exactly as Emily says, it retains your ability to commercialise the back parts of the latter parts of the site, and procure it separately.
And Emily, you mentioned smart grids earlier. That sounds fun. What are they?
Well, I'm no expert at this, but broad principles are, you have potential microgrids. So you have, it tends to be all electric, but you're interlinking technology in the house. So solar panels, PV with kind of hot water systems. Everyone would have like a hive machine, and then you also have some battery storage either on plot or kind of within a communal area. And effectively, you're linking your house to batteries, to your neighbours that operate in a bit of a community, that everybody you can generate some power. If you don't use that, your neighbours can use your power. You get a bit of a rebate. Your neighbour gets it cheaper. And you're working kind of as a community using battery in each other before then having to kind of ask the grid for some more. So as a base principle, it's a lot more of a community model where you're benefiting. If you're a low user, you benefit from somebody else, or a high user, you should benefit from your neighbours. But again, commercially and contractually, they're not regulated. Hopefully they'll become that, because I think there's a huge benefit to that. And I do think that's, a solution that will become the norm in 10 years time. I've worked with a couple of operators that are doing it, and there are models out there, but they, contractually and commercially, they've got a bit of a way to go for the regulation. So I think, Matt, please chip in if I've got any of that absolutely wrong, but that's how I see it in really base terms.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with pretty much all of that. When you think about it in the most basic form, district heating is putting more things in the ground, whereas smart networks, smart microgrids are not. You're sort of using a purely electrified system to manage your demand in a smarter way, I suppose. And there's other benefits that sit around that, around your ability to have an EV charging point, for example, that sort of isn't actually physically connected to your house. So you could have a centralized EV charging hub, and one of those chargers could be yours. You could have a virtual MPAN for that, and it could be entirely yours and billed to you. And that, for sort of higher density kind of residential development, is a really important point. There's lots of things online at the moment about trying to come up with like channels through footpaths and things to provide routes for cables to get to cars that are parked on road and things. And that's not the aspiration of new developments, but it is a solution that adds flexibility. And it doesn't have to be, a one size fits all. I think some of the district heating systems that are being implemented have an element of sort of smart microgrid solution kind of built into the system. But what current regulation doesn't allow you to do is sort of amalgamate all that PV on all the plots and centralize that solution, as Emily says, to sort of, democratize the use of that energy and allow it to be distributed where it needs to be, and sort of everybody get the benefit from it. And I think, the major difficulty is again, as Emily says, is the regulation. These things are very difficult to make fly on large schemes where they are not robustly regulated, and where you can't sort of evidence that, but they do feel to me like they could be the thing that wins out in the sort of longer term. I think it feels simpler than adding a district heating system to a scheme, to my mind.
I do like the idea of, whereas once upon a time someone would have popped over to their neighbour to borrow a cup of sugar, it's now they're popping over to their neighbours. Can I have a few kilowatts, please? I've got a roast doing this. I'm going on this evening. Okay, so it sounds like an industry that is changing hugely and continues to do so. So finally, then, as we finish off, what kind of changes? And Emily, we'll come to you first. What kind of changes can we expect in the coming years in the utility world?
I mean, I think we've touched on some of it, but I do think that we're on a real dynamic journey at the moment, and it's really changing at a pace. So what we're trying to do now, I probably know in the next kind of 2-3 years will probably be changing again. And the challenge for developers is trying to think of all those things now and future-proof our developments in a certain way. And we're not going to get it right all the time, but I think trying to be flexibly minded to try and kind of achieve that net zero journey over the kind of 5-10 years. A lot of the planning approvals are kind of requiring the journey to net zero, and I think we're certainly keen to do that. I just think we need to work as an industry now to kind of educate the whole spectrum of the industry to try and make sure that happens, because at the moment it's there's so much change and it's happening really quickly that you run the risk of kind of people being left behind on it. And I think ultimately we will get to a solution where you have a bit of everything built in. I think, and on some of the schemes I'm looking at how to, do the more norm to start with, but then future proof for other solutions later on. And I think, and that's all we can do at the moment, but it's really exciting. I said, Matt mentioned briefly drainage, and, me being a civils, that's, that's another kind of great change that's happened over the kind of past few years, really, and kind of bringing in the independence with the drainage to make it more, more competition in the market, because, it's really difficult when you're kind of stuck with an incumbent that you're tearing your hair out because they're under-resourced. The whole industry's under-resourced from a public sector point of view. So, having some more people, in the industry has been a great move. So I just see more of that to come, really.
Matt, anything to add?
Yeah, I think the continuation of more options, I think, is probably what's going to happen. I think we've been in a world for 5 or 6 years where, it's been relatively linear. It's been multi-utility providers, and there hasn't been sort of that much differentiation. But I think over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years, all these different solutions are going to multiply. People will come up with different spins on district heating and different spins on smart grids, and people will look at the director-developer IDNO stuff and split all that out, and you might even go so far as to split out the design and the construction and the IDNO stuff and do that differently and procure it in sort of more of a drainage kind of way, where you do the design work entirely separately from everything else, and alongside that, the sort of more traditional multi-utility stuff will also have its place on schemes. So I think the main thing will be that sort of these things will continue to diverge, I think, and we'll have more and more sort of fundamentally different options for sites, which is great, because as Emily says, every site has got its own drivers, and there will be something that fits each of those things. But yeah, I think there's a lot to happen over the course of the next couple of years, and it's going to see lots of different sort of solutions come to market that are going to be quite interesting, I think.
What I would encourage the kind of industry to do, and the kind of asset owners, is to try and make things as easy as possible, and to try and give examples of financial models and metrics of how it works, contractually how it works, because ultimately, if you want the asset, you've got to be able to sell the solution, sell it. I've asked multiple, IDNOs, okay, give me an example of when you've done X, Y, and Z, and you really struggle to get that in a way that you can fully understand it. And if us at the developer world can't do it, then we've got no hope in trying to kind of market that through to the end users. So I think there's a bit of work to be done there to try and get some more, done more clearly.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both very much for your time. That was really, really interesting, really insightful. There's a lot of moving parts, so it's interesting to see how the future of the utilities industry will pan out. If you're listening to this, you're interested to find out more, you can find each of us on LinkedIn, or just head over to the Brookbanks website at brookbanks.com, and you'll find more information about how we support master developers like Made Partnership. And there's also a contact page there to get in touch. But there we go. It remains for me to say thank you very much to Matt Capper, and thank you also to Emily Timmins of Made Partnership for joining us today. And thank you for listening.